30 years. That's how long my father, Marcus, took to build Richard Medical Solutions into a regional titan. And it took him exactly 30 seconds to give it all away to my younger brother, Julian, right in front of everyone I had ever known. We were in a glittering hotel ballroom in downtown Philadelphia, the last night of the year. My father stood on a stage, a crystal champagne flute in his hand, addressing a crowd of investors and politicians. He announced he was handing the legacy of his company to Julian. My brother, in a bespoke suit, stood beside him, a triumphant smile plastered across his face, like a king who had just won a war he never fought. The room erupted in applause. Glasses clinked. The band struck up a celebratory chord. I stood near the back, by the exit doors. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just opened my phone. 11 minutes after midnight, my father's chief of staff leaned in and whispered something in his ear. I watched the color drain from Marcus's face. He dropped his glass, and it shattered on the hardwood floor. What my father didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the email I had approved at midnight had already reached a federal inbox. Federal agencies, it turns out, don't sleep on holidays. To understand how I dismantled my own bloodline, we have to go back 14 months. I was 34, living in Pennsylvania, and serving as the vice president of internal audit for Richard Medical Solutions, a company that manufactured surgical supplies. My life was built on structure. I arrived at the office at 6 a.m., before the heating even kicked in. I liked the quiet. I liked the spreadsheets. Numbers don't lie. And they certainly don't play favorites. If there's a flaw, the math shows it. It was a Tuesday morning when the math stopped making sense. I was reviewing the quarterly procurement logs when a single line item caught my eye. $42,000 paid to a vendor called Keystone Logistics. The amount wasn't enough to trigger an automatic board review, but it was just high enough to require my signature. Except my signature wasn't on it. The routing slip was blank where my name should have been. I walked down the hall to accounts payable. Brenda, who had been with us for 9 years, stopped typing the moment I placed the printed invoice on her keyboard. She didn't look up, just stared at her screen, her hand hovering over the mouse. "Who pushed this through?" I asked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Julian brought it down himself on Friday afternoon. He said it was an expedited freight contract." Julian was 28. My father had made him vice president of sales just 3 months earlier. He had a corner office, a company car, and a habit of leaving at 3 p.m. on Thursdays to play golf. He had never stepped foot in the accounts payable department in his life. I took the invoice back to my office. I didn't call Julian. I didn't call my father. I sat at my desk and pulled the state business registration for Keystone Logistics. The search returned a single result: a limited liability company registered 12 days ago. The business address wasn't a warehouse or a shipping hub. It was a strip mall in Ohio, nestled between a nail salon and a vacant storefront. There were no listed directors, no phone numbers, just a registered agent in Delaware. My office door opened without a knock. Julian walked in, holding a cup of coffee. He leaned against the doorframe and took a sip. "Brenda said you were asking about Keystone," he said, his tone casual, light. The sound of someone who thought the rules applied to everyone else. "The invoice bypass protocol," I stated. "It requires an audit signature." Julian smiled. "Dad cleared it. He said we needed the supply line secured before the end of the quarter." "Don't worry about it, Naomi. Just keep the rest of the books clean." He tapped the doorframe twice and walked away, leaving the scent of expensive cologne hanging in the air. Dad cleared it. That phrase echoed in my head. My father was a meticulous man. He built a regional medical supply empire by counting every penny. He didn't bypass protocol for a $42,000 freight contract to a phantom company in Ohio. Not unless there was a reason. I printed the Keystone registration, folded it in half, and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I locked the drawer. A minor nepotism issue is one thing. Creating ghost vendors is another. An hour later, an email hit my inbox. Priority: Hi. Sender: Marcus Richard. Subject line: Mandatory executive meeting at noon. No agenda attached. I looked at the locked drawer. The timing was too perfect. Julian had spoken to our father. Now Marcus was calling the executives into a room. My pulse quickened just a fraction. I smoothed my skirt, picked up my notepad, and walked toward the boardroom, wondering if my father already knew I was hunting his shadow. The boardroom doors were heavy oak and closed with a soft click that sealed out the noise of the manufacturing floor. 12 executives sat around a polished mahogany table. My father sat at the head. Julian sat to his right. I took a chair near the middle, setting my notepad down, waiting for the invoice from Keystone Logistics to be projected onto the screens. I braced myself for the reprimand, preparing my defense of accounting protocols. Marcus didn't mention the invoice. He didn't look at me. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and leaned forward with both hands flat on the table. He offered a practiced warm smile, the kind he used when he was about to sell something expensive to someone who didn't need it. He spoke about the future. He used words like synergy, aggressive market positioning, and next-generation leadership. Then he dropped the anchor. He announced a corporate restructuring, effective immediately. Julian was being elevated to a newly created role, Chief Operating Officer in Training. The room went still. Nobody breathed. 2 years ago, a global supply chain collapse had nearly bankrupted Richard Medical Solutions. Raw material costs quadrupled overnight. Shipping routes dried up. I spent 4 months sleeping on a cot in my office, renegotiating vendor terms, restructuring our short-term debt, and finding secondary suppliers in markets nobody else wanted to touch. I kept the margins intact. I kept the assembly lines running. When the crisis passed, Marcus stood in this very room and thanked the entire logistics team for their hard work. Generic, safe, distributed praise. Now, Julian was receiving the crown. Julian, whose only contribution to the crisis was complaining that his quarterly bonus had been delayed. My father looked down the table and finally met my eyes. He said the board recognized my operational expertise. Because of that, I was being publicly tasked with mentoring Julian through his transition. I was to guide my younger brother, share my departmental insights, and ensure his path to the COO chair was unobstructed. I looked at Julian. He was leaning back in his leather chair, ankles crossed under the table. He offered a faint smirk, treating the executive boardroom like a fraternity lounge, where the pledges did the heavy lifting while he collected the dues. I didn't flush. I didn't bite my lip. I kept my hands folded on the table. My pulse remained steady. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second and remembered the smell of old paper and stale coffee from those 4 months I lived in my office. I remembered the exhaustion, the relentless pressure, the quiet desperation to keep the company alive. And I remembered my father's empty praise. I opened my eyes. The battle lines had been drawn. My father had just publicly declared that my competence was merely a tool to elevate his favored son. He expected me to be the loyal, silent architect of my own obsolescence. He expected me to be a good daughter. But the math, as always, told a different story. The math showed me that Marcus Richard had just made a very expensive mistake. I spent the next 6 months being the perfect mentor. I taught Julian everything. I showed him how to read a balance sheet, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to identify market trends. I even taught him the subtle art of corporate politics. He absorbed it all, not because he was brilliant, but because I was a meticulous teacher. I documented every lesson, every meeting, every email, every piece of advice I gave him. I built a comprehensive digital record of my mentorship, a meticulous paper trail of my obedience. Meanwhile, the phantom vendor, Keystone Logistics, continued to appear in the quarterly reports, always for amounts just below the threshold for automatic board review, but always requiring my signature. And every time, my signature was conspicuously absent. I kept a separate, encrypted ledger, tracking every payment to Keystone, every bypassed protocol, every missing signature. I was building a case, not just against Julian, but against the system that protected him. The real game changer came 3 months later. I received a cryptic email from an anonymous source. The subject line was simply, Project Apex. The email contained a single attachment, a heavily redacted internal memo from my father's office, outlining a plan for a strategic acquisition by a New York-based private equity firm. The memo hinted at a massive, accelerated revenue recognition scheme designed to inflate the company's valuation before the sale. It was a classic pump and dump. and it was illegal. I knew then that Keystone Logistics was just a small piece of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle. My father wasn't just playing favorites, he was orchestrating a massive fraud. And he was using Julian as a pawn, and me as a convenient scapegoat. The memo also mentioned a due diligence review by the acquiring firm's forensic auditors. If they uncovered the fraud, the entire deal would collapse, and my father would be ruined. But more importantly, if they found my missing signatures on the Keystone invoices, I would be implicated. My father was not just passively allowing me to take the fall, he had actively, aggressively engineered my destruction. He viewed me not as a daughter, but as a sacrificial asset, a protective shield to be discarded the moment the private equity funds cleared his accounts. The betrayal hit me with the force of a physical impact. It was one thing to suspect my father was framing me. It was another to hold the written directive in my hands. I didn't weep. The shock crystallized instantly into a cold, weaponized clarity. I pulled my phone from my trench coat and photographed every single page of Project Apex. I captured the email chains, the offshore routing numbers, and the damning handwritten margins. I documented the entire architecture of his criminal empire. I returned the folder to its exact position at the back of the credenza. I pushed the mahogany door shut and locked the brass mechanism, leaving no trace of my intrusion. I checked my watch. 2:20 a.m. I had 20 minutes before the night guard initiated his final sweep of the executive floor. I stood up, adjusting my coat. I turned toward the office door, ready to begin my extraction. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the hallway. Footsteps! The night guard was early. Panic seized my throat. I killed the penlight, plunging the office into darkness. The footsteps grew louder, moving deliberately down the executive corridor. They were approaching my father's office. I pressed myself against the wall, sliding behind the heavy velvet drapes flanking the panoramic windows. I held my breath, gripping the fabric, praying the moonlight would not betray my silhouette. The doorknob rattled. The commercial deadbolt which I had locked behind me held firm. A bright beam of light sliced under the gap at the bottom of the door. The guard was standing directly outside, sweeping his flashlight across the threshold. I heard the crackle of a two-way radio, a burst of static, and a muffled voice confirming the fourth floor was secure. The beam of light vanished. The heavy footsteps slowly retreated down the hall, fading into the ambient hum of the building. I waited 5 agonizing minutes before stepping out from behind the drapes. I exited the office, relocked the deadbolt with my plastic bypass tool, and descended the fire stairs. I slipped out through the service doors, pressing the clear packing tape back over the strike plate, leaving the fortress exactly as I found it. I walked the 3 blocks back to my car, the cold air burning my lungs. I possessed the smoking gun. The SEC whistleblower petition was now fully armed. I had the power to detonate the entire acquisition. But as I drove home through the deserted streets, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. An automated calendar alert from the executive suite. A mandatory meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. Subject line: Family Trust Restructuring. The New York buyers were arriving soon, and Marcus was about to demand a final humiliating sacrifice. I had secured the weapon to destroy him, but what horrific price was he going to extract from me before I could pull the trigger? I arrived at the corporate campus at 8 a.m., running on less than 2 hours of sleep. The adrenaline from the midnight breach had faded, leaving a cold, sharp focus in its wake. The encrypted photographs of Project Apex were already transmitting to Claire through our secure portal. The smoking gun was safe, but the notification on my phone demanded my presence in the executive conference room. My father was not finished shifting the pieces on his board. I walked into the meeting room at precisely 9. The atmosphere was sterile and formal, devoid of the usual morning banter. Marcus sat at the head of the long glass table. Julian lounged in the chair to his right, spinning a silver pen between his fingers. What surprised me was the presence of the other 3 people in the room. 2 men in identical charcoal suits sat opposite Julian. They were outside legal counsel, corporate architects hired to draft ironclad contracts, and sitting next to my father, sipping tea from a porcelain cup, was Sylvia. My stepmother did not attend operational meetings. Her domain was the estate, the charity galas, and the country club. Her presence here indicated this was not a business discussion. This was an ambush cloaked in the language of family duty. I took the empty seat at the far end of the table. Marcus nodded to the senior attorney, a man with thinning hair and a voice like dry gravel. The attorney opened a thick manila folder and slid a bound document across the glass. It stopped inches from my hands. The cover page read, Irrevocable Family Trust Restructuring Agreement. Naomi, my father began, his tone carrying the practiced gravity of a seasoned diplomat. As you know, the New York buyers are conducting their final preliminary reviews before they deploy their forensic auditors. They are scrutinizing our capitalization table. They prefer a clean, consolidated equity structure. Fragmented ownership shares create administrative friction during a buyout of this scale. I looked down at the document. I held a 10% equity stake in Richard Medical Solutions. I had not been gifted those shares. I earned them. They were my compensation for restructuring the vendor debt and saving the logistics pipeline 2 years ago. That equity represented my life savings, my retirement, and the tangible proof of my decade of grueling labor. To present a unified front to the buyers, Marcus explained, the family trust needed to be simplified. All individual equity holdings were to be consolidated into a single, controlling stake held by Julian as the designated successor. This is a formality, Naomi. Sylvia interjected, her voice soft but firm. It's for the good of the family. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Julian offered another of his smirks. Marcus watched me, his expression unreadable. He expected me to sign. He expected me to surrender my life's work for the sake of his fraud and his favored son. He expected me to be a good daughter. But I was no longer just a daughter. I was a whistleblower. I was a woman who had spent 14 months meticulously documenting my father's betrayal. I had the evidence. I had the power. And I had a deadline. New Year's Eve. I picked up the pen. My father's eyes narrowed, a flicker of satisfaction in their depths. Julian leaned forward, a silent cheer. Sylvia offered a small, knowing smile. They thought they had won. They thought I was broken, but they had forgotten the math. The math always balances. I signed the document. My signature was clear, precise, and unwavering. Then I slid the document back across the table. There, I said, my voice calm, steady. Now that we've tidied up the family trust, I have a small matter of my own to address. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a slim, unmarked envelope. I placed it on the table, directly in front of my father. This, I continued, is a copy of the whistleblower petition I filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission at midnight. It details the full extent of Project Apex, the Keystone Logistics phantom vendor scheme, and the fraudulent revenue recognition practices designed to inflate the company's value for the upcoming acquisition. The room went silent. The lawyers stared, their faces pale. Julian's pen clattered to the glass table. Sylvia's porcelain teacup trembled in her hand. My father's eyes, usually so calculating, were wide with disbelief. You wouldn't, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Oh, but I would, Dad, I replied, a cold, hard satisfaction settling in my chest. The SEC doesn't sleep on holidays. And neither do I. The New Year's Eve party was a blur. The chief of staff's whispered words, my father's shattered glass. The applause died. The band stopped playing. The triumphant chord turned into a dissonant silence. The SEC investigation began within days. The acquisition was immediately halted. Project Apex unraveled. Julian, who had never truly worked a day in his life, found himself facing federal charges for his role in the fraud. My father, Marcus, the titan who built an empire, was stripped of his company, his reputation, and his freedom. He built a company from a single delivery truck into a regional titan. He possessed the work ethic, the drive, and the sheer force of will that defines traditional American success. But somewhere along that grueling climb, he confused the creation of wealth with the cultivation of character. He forgot that the ultimate responsibility of a parent is not to hand a child a kingdom, but to raise a human being capable of surviving the weight of the crown. In traditional family structures, there is a profound, sacred duty to instill honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness in the next generation. These are not merely pleasant ideals. They are the structural beams that keep a family from collapsing under the pressure of the real world. Marcus abandoned those beams the moment he decided his son's gender and name were more valuable than his daughter's competence and integrity. Consider the profound disservice Marcus did to his golden son. By crowning Julian the heir apparent without requiring him to earn the title, Marcus did not elevate his boy. He crippled him. Parenting requires the courage to let your children face the consequences of their inadequacies. When a child learns that their mistakes will always be swept away by a parent's wealth or influence, they do not grow into leaders. They grow into fragile, arrogant adults who believe the rules of gravity do not apply to them. Marcus taught Julian how to wear a bespoke suit and order expensive wine. But he never taught him the quiet, unglamorous virtue of accountability. By shielding his son from the friction of hard work, Marcus unknowingly paved Julian's road to a federal penitentiary. Then consider the daughter. Naomi was taught an entirely different, infinitely darker lesson. In a family that lacks emotional awareness, the competent child is rarely celebrated. They are utilized. Naomi was groomed to be the load-bearing wall of the family's ego. She was taught that her brilliance was only valuable so long as it served to prop up her brother's illusions. When a family demands that one child shrink so another can feel tall, it ceases to be a sanctuary and becomes a psychological battlefield. Sylvia's repeated weaponized plea, "Don't make this harder than it has to be," is the anthem of a family terrified of emotional truth. It is the sound of a mother choosing the comfort of a lie over the difficult, messy reality of holding her family to a standard of fairness. They demanded silence to keep the peace, but suppressing the truth never buys peace. It merely finances a much larger war. What the Richard family failed to understand is that long-term guidance requires looking past the horizon of your own vanity. True legacy is not a corporate masthead or a soaring profit margin. Legacy is the moral compass you leave behind in the minds of your children. Marcus tried to artificially manufacture a legacy by orchestrating a massive fraud. He believed he could cheat the math, cheat the federal government, and cheat his own daughter. He failed to realize that the most dangerous thing you can do to a brilliant, overlooked child is to teach her how to survive in the dark. Because when you banish a child to the shadows, you give them the perfect cover to dismantle the stage you are standing on. We tell these stories because they are mirrors held up to our own lives. We share these blueprints of betrayal and justice, not just for the thrill of the climax, but for the profound lessons buried in the wreckage. If you find value in these reflections, if you want to continue exploring the complex, often dangerous dynamics of human relationships and the quiet strength it takes to break toxic cycles, subscribe to the Revenge Order channel. We will keep bringing you the stories that remind us why the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, always eventually finds the light. As you walk away from Naomi's story, take a moment to look at your own life. Look at the dynamics playing out in your living room or across the table at your next holiday dinner. We all construct narratives about who we are and what we owe to the people who share our blood. But ask yourself, what lessons are truly being taught in the quiet moments between the words? Who is being asked to carry the weight? Who is being handed the unearned crown? And who is sitting quietly at the edge of the room watching, learning, and deciding exactly what kind of legacy they are willing to accept? The answers might surprise you, because in every family, just like in every corporate ledger, the math eventually has to balance. The only question left is who will be holding the pen when the final tally is drawn.